The Book of Mormon is tough, wrote Hugh Nibley in 1952. It thrives on investigation. You may kick it around like a football, as many have done, and I promise you it will wear you out long before you ever make a dent in it. From Joseph Smith's day to present, critics have condemned elements in the Book of Mormon they claim were impossible and absurd. Yet in doing so, I maintain they have often highlighted subjects worthy of Latter-day Saint attention that with patience, diligent, and careful study frequently lead to important insights which support the claims of that ancient record. Evidence for the Book of Mormon can take a variety of forms. Today, I will focus on just one kind of evidence called howlers in the Book of Mormon, things once laughed at in the Book of Mormon, which have since been proven true. Nibley described this once as follows: "It is the howlers with which the Book of Mormon abounds that furnish the best index to its authenticity. They show, first of all, that the book was definitely not a typical product of its time, and secondly, when they're examined more closely in light of present-day evidence, they appear very different indeed than they did 100 years ago. From a faith-grounded perspective, Latter-day Saints can benefit from the fruits of careful Book of Mormon scholarship in more recent years. Today, with a few exceptions, I will be referencing the work of others, but I will not repeat the examples Nibley cited, but rather will add about a dozen or more examples from what is becoming a growing corpus of howler evidence for the Book of Mormon, inadvertently brought to the attention of Latter-day Saints by the diligent labors of past critics, for which we should be ever thankful. Not all criticisms of the Book of Mormon are worth answering. Here's a couple from several early critics. Alexander Campbell: Nephi knew all about steamboats 2,400 years ago. This was an interesting one. A fellow accosted a Mormon missionary on a stagecoach in 1837 and complained, "I had read the Book of Mormon enough to find the terms gunpowder, mariner's compass, and several others introduced into a silly story about Nephi. There are also references to pistols and other firearms. These Jews, Lehi and his family, are supposed to have immigrated from Jerusalem. A mysterious wheel rolls before them to guide them." I think we'd agree these are pretty silly. Now, I don't want to spend time on that today, but what I would like to talk about is some of the things that Nibley referred to. Some of the criticisms that have been a little more challenging to respond to, criticisms that were raised by those in the past. In doing this, I'm going to be citing statements by these critics and then talking about how those have more recently been answered. For many years, critics of the Book of Mormon dismissed the names found in the Book of Mormon as modern in origin. In recent decades, however, we have benefited from the work of some Latter-day Saint scholars well-trained in Semitic languages who have focused attention on Book of Mormon names, and their work is bearing fruit. Some of these findings include attested non-biblical names from ancient texts, monuments, seals, bullae, arrowheads, etc., mostly discovered since Joseph Smith's day. And some of these also are found in abbreviated forms which are like those in the Book of Mormon. Hebrew and Egyptian names, etymologies of names reflected in the Book of Mormon text, names in the Hebrew text that are not in the English translation but are there, like Jershon, which means to inherit. Sebus is another one that's been recently noted. Non-biblical Book of Mormon names with plausible etymologies like Iriantum. But I'm just going to focus on 3 of these today. This is a critic around the turn of the last century. There's not a scrap of evidence in support of any of the following names of heads under which the Book of Mormon has been divided: Nephi, Alma, etc. This altogether remarkable production of an over-imaginative mind bears evidence of eagerness with which the would-be prophet sought to study his prophet. Get it? Most of the names are philologically impossible. Okay. Now, I want to talk about Nephi for just a minute. Now, some of the earliest critics of the Book of Mormon like to make fun of this one. In 1830, a writer for the Rochester Gem parodied the Book of Mormon containing the books Nephi, Nimshi, Pukai, Buckeye as the work of an ignoramus. Abner Cole, who thought that joke was too good to let die, produced not one but two installments of the Book of Pukai in the Palmyra Register. Here we've got another critic, as I mentioned before, mentioned Nephi as being a name that was not very likely. Now, critics have kind of dismissed this. They thought that perhaps Joseph Smith got the name Nephi from a mistranslation in the Apocrypha of the word Naphtar. In any case, there's been a lot of speculation about that. But thanks to efforts of scholars such as John Gee and more recently Matt Bowen, whose important work I hope you're following, it's been being published in Interpreter and is soon coming out with a book dealing with Book of Mormon names. We now know that Nephi is an attested Egyptian name. As John Gee notes, Nephi is an attested Syro-Palestinian Semitic form of an attested Egyptian man's name dating from the late period in Egypt, Lehi's day. It is appropriate that Nephi notes early connections between Egypt and Israel at his time, for his own name is Egyptian. It is the proper form of a proper name of the proper gender from the proper place and proper time. Now that's interesting enough, but the name itself, its meaning is also interesting. Nephi is Egyptian Nefer. It's the same word that's been used in like Nefertiti and several other Egyptian names. But it means good, fine, goodly, beautiful, fair. And by Nephi's day, the R had come to be pronounced with an E, so it would have sounded like Nephi, as you find in translations of the Book of Mormon into Spanish or some of the European languages, which is kind of interesting. Now note, given the meaning of Nephi in Egyptian, good, fine, goodly, beautiful, fair, I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, having a great knowledge of the goodness of God. You have Mormon, after the destruction at Cumorah, O ye fair ones, O ye fair ones, ye fair sons and daughters, ye fair ones. Well, think about that in light of the name Nephi as he sees the destruction of his people. Here's one more from Helaman. Behold, I have given unto you the names of our first parents, Nephi and Lehi. And this I have done, that when you remember your names, you may remember them. When you remember them, you may remember their works. And when you remember their works, you may know how it is said and also written that they were good. Okay, isn't that interesting? How did Joseph Smith come up with that? Hypocoristic names. These are abbreviated forms of names. This is one critic, Origen Batchelor, who was a colorful character. One of Nephi's brothers was a real Yankee, Sam. Well done, Prophet Smith. You can't get rid of your Jonathanisms. Sam indeed. Fie, Joseph, how you forget yourself. Can't you forge better than this? Precious little Yankee wit have you in your composition to let a Yankeeism creep into your ancient Book of Nephi in this manner. Sam, Josh, Gid. There's a Yankee for ye. Rather out of place in ancient writings, Sam, Josh, and Gid are half names or Jonathanisms. Well, it's interesting. The hypocoristic names have now been found in pre-exilic Hebrew inscriptions on arrowheads, on bullae, and stamp seals, including the names Sam and Josh, in that form, in that shortened form, which are not the way they appear in the Bible. One that was kind of interesting to me when we found it a number of years ago is the name Aha, which I noticed in an issue of Biblical Archaeology Review a number of years ago, and we looked up the book and found some other ones. But there's an arrowhead inscribed, says, the arrowhead of Aha, son of Ashtart, dates to about 1000 BC from Syro-Palestine. So this is kind of an interesting find. Now, one other example, when we're talking about names, and I want to talk about Gidgiddoni. This is a fairly recent one, which you may not know about. As you know, Gidgiddoni is this great general in the Book of Mormon. Note the D and the double D, the Gidgid. This is not a stuttering problem that the translator of the Book of Mormon had. Turns out this name is now attested. known to be attested in late Assyrian inscriptions. That is, from the period of Assyria, the time when they were attacking northern Israel. So it's something that could very well have been on a name that could have been on the brass plates. John Gee notes the name Gidgiddoni with its reduplication of the double consonant, that double D. We know now it is not a Hebrew name. It's a well-attested name in Neo-Assyrian records. It appears at least 5 times that we know about. It comes from the same Assyrian Empire that is discussed so extensively in the works of Isaiah. The name is mentioned many times in Assyrian records, covering a number of individuals. So you've got Gidgiddoni in the Book of Mormon. You have a similar on Gidgiddona. And then you have Gidgiddoni, which is a member of the chariotry during the reign of Sargon. Sargon was one of the kings that attacked the northern kingdom of Israel. And this was just published in 1999, and we just recently noticed it. So, Book of Mormon names. Now let's talk about Laban's steel sword. Good old E.D. Howe, who wrote the father of all anti-Mormon books. This is the earliest account of steel found in history. Another critic. Laban's sword was steel when it's a notorious fact that Israelites knew nothing of steel for hundreds of years afterward. Who but as ignorant a person as Rigdon would have perpetrated all these blunders? Well, in 1982, they reported this in Biblical Archaeology Review again. These are 2 pictures here of a steel sword that they found at Vera Jericho, and it's 1 meter long. The handle, the hilt had perished, but this was still, this is what they found, and they have it in a plaster to kind of keep it from falling apart. And it's now in the Israeli Museum here in a display here in Jerusalem. And let me just read you what the caption says. It speaks for itself. This rare and exceptionally long sword, which was discovered on the floor of a building next to the skeleton of a man, dates to the end of the First Temple period. The sword is over 1 meter long and has a double-edged blade with a prominent central ridge running along its entire length. The hilt was originally inlaid with material that has not survived, most probably wood. Only the nails that once secured the inlays to the hilt can still be seen. Owing to the length of the weight of the sword, it was probably necessary to hold it with 2 hands. The sword is made of iron hardened into steel, attesting to a substantial metallurgical know-how. Over the years, it has become cracked due to corrosion. Go Team Nephi. Now, Jack's here today, so I threw in 2 of these in his honor, which he has talked about. Killing Laban, Leroy Sunderland, 1838. Book of Mormon's filled with details of murder and bloodshed. The holiest men of whom it speaks were murderers. Nephi murdered Laban in cold blood, and this too by God's direction. Okay, well, is that true? Now, a lot of us have, from the standpoint of modern people, we sometimes struggle with this story of Nephi chopping off poor Laban's head in a dark alley of Jerusalem. But how would they have seen it in Nephi's day? And that's the question that Jack wanted to look at. In the very first issue of the Journal Book of Mormon Studies a number of years ago, he published an article on the slaying of Laban, which I urge you to read. And let me just mention a few things. There are other details that he talks about there, and you want to get the full version if you're interested in this. But we have the passage in Exodus, which kind of governs the rules concerning murder. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. If the man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. And if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. Now Nephi makes it clear in 1 Nephi that his actions were not premeditated. I'm referring to Jack here. He did not lie in wait for Laban. He says, I was led by the Spirit, not knowing beforehand the things which I should do. Unlike Joab, who killed Abner and Amasa in King David's day, Nephi did not act with anger or guile in killing. He explains he did not want to do it. It was only with some difficulty the Spirit convinced him to act. Additionally, the Spirit and Nephi each reference the very passage from the Law of Moses to emphasize the justification of Nephi's actions. The Lord hath delivered him into thy hands. Given the wickedness of Jerusalem at that time, Nephi would not likely have been able to obtain a fair trial, but the Lord appointed a place for him to flee for refuge in a new land of promise, as Jack points out. He also provides additional reasons that support seeing this case as legally and in ancient Israelite context divinely justified under the circumstances. And this is a great book if you haven't seen it. He doesn't talk about this particular case, but I understand he's working on another one on homicide in the Book of Mormon. I understand it'll be a killer book. When 19th century vocabularies and concepts are in some ways useful in Book of Mormon exegesis or interpretation, Laban's episode is a case where the 19th century environment offers little help. Joseph Smith's 19th century audience was just as scandalized by Nephi's killing of Laban as is a modern audience. But when analyzed in terms of ancient biblical law, the case is framed with an appropriate set of legal terms and issues. This is not to say the slaying of Laban presents us modern readers with an easy case. Neither was it an easy case for Nephi. In its ancient legal context, however, the slaying of Laban makes sense both legally and religiously as an unpremeditated, undesired, divinely excusable, and justifiable killing, something very different from what people today normally think of as criminal homicide. All right, so there's Jack. Now, this is another one. Jack, this is a critic you may or may not have known, James Williams, around the turn of the last century. At a later period occurred the trial of Nephi for the murder of Seantum, the chief judge. The real murderer was the judge's brother, who was forced to confess by a series of confessions based on threats such as would undoubtedly be rejected by the judge of an English criminal court. Finally comes the statement, because of this fear and this paleness which has come upon your face, behold, we know that thou art guilty. Well, yeah, an English court would look at it very differently, but the Book of Mormon wasn't based on laws from an English court, was it? Well, Jack notes that in biblical period, the normal two witnesses rule could be overridden in special cases of self-incriminating confession, although that was not normally the case. If confession occurred outside of court, or if God's will was evidenced in the manner by ordeal, lots, or otherwise in the detection of the offender, and if corroborating physical evidence of the crime could be produced. Seantum's self-incriminating confession satisfies all three of these requirements precisely, and thus his conviction was ensured. His conviction was spontaneous and before trial. The evidence of God's will was supplied through Nephi's prophecy. Tangible evidence was present in the blood found on Seantum's cloak, and these factors under biblical law would override the normal Jewish concerns about the use of self-incriminating confessions to obtain a conviction. All right. Let's talk about Lehi and Desert a little bit. I just want to touch on this because Warren spoke this morning, and if you're at all familiar with his books, which you should be, he's found some wonderful things here. Let me just note here, these are all elements of Lehi's story of their journey in the wilderness that have been mocked by critics. Okay, and I won't go into each one of these. Although each of these has been mocked, each of these we now know make very good sense in light of the context of the ancient context of First Nephi. Here's one critic. They came to a fertile country which they call the land bountiful. This country, according to the description of Nephi, has given the course of his travels, must have been on the coast of the Sea of Arabia or the Indian Ocean, which is a barren, sandy desert. Ha. Well, you know, this is from, there are a number of places you can go to find illustration of Lehi's journey. If you look there on the eastern coast there, we find places like one particular place that Brother Aston was talking about, which we see here. Let me mention just one other one. Although the territory is one in that expanse is comparable to the portion of the United States lying between the Mississippi and the Atlantic Ocean, yet in all that range of territory, there has been no metal discovered that would be suitable for ship construction except in the central part of the Sinai Peninsula, either of which is hundreds of miles distant from the reputed spot where the vessel was built. And this fact goes far to strengthen the oft-repeated assertion that the author and proprietor of the Book of Mormon was illiterate. That's from Samuel Traum in 1910. Well, a number of years ago, not too long ago, there were several BYU geologists that went back there, and they tell their story. If you've seen the movie Journey of Faith, the first one, which is pretty good, they talk about this. Well, they found ore. And here, at our first landing, we saw red and orange stripes cutting through the bedrock. Most of us knew exactly what that meant. They were red and orange because there was iron in those seams that had rusted. They're right not too far from Wadi's site. We spent a few days documenting that and found the other site with iron. When we got back to Muscat and asked the Ministry of Mines in Oman about these occurrences, they confirmed they were completely unknown to anyone. Swiss and Japanese geologists had made recent geological maps of the area, but had found no iron. Ministry of Mines, whose personnel really know more about geology of Oman than anyone, confirmed that these were new discoveries, and that means no one knew about them until the year 2000. Revel Phillips notes the iron ore in only these two areas is right on the surface of the ground. We have veins of iron ore coming up through the metamorphic rock right to the surface of the ground. And collecting it would have been no problem at all. Nephi could have collected enough iron ore in a matter of a few minutes to make all the tools he would want, and it was right by the coast. Go Team Nephi. As Neveley says, this is back in 1952, just as true today. There is no point at all to the question who wrote the Book of Mormon. It would have been quite as impossible for the most learned man alive in 1830 to have written the book as it was for Joseph Smith. And whoever would account for the Book of Mormon by any theory suggested so far, save one, must completely rule out the first 40 pages. All right, let's talk about this one. It's a 600-year prophecy of Lehi. You find this in the Book of Mormon in 3 different places. 600 years from the time my father left Jerusalem, Messiah is going to come. And this is a number of places here. E.D. Howe again. According to history and according to Jeremiah, in the 9th year of the reign of Zedekiah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, besieged Jerusalem, which was 606 years before the Christian era. Here we see the ignorant author has made a great mistake. If you read John Sorensen's book, Ancient American Setting in the Book of Mormon, he mentions this. Suppose the Nephites used the same system of counting time as the Maya. And remember, Lehi is giving this prophecy to his children who are going to the new promised land. The prophesied 600 years in that reckoning, the reckoning of the Maya, using as an example, would constitute precisely 1.5 baktuns, 30 katuns, a neat total of 216 something days. But this count of 600 tune years would be about 3,156 days shorter than the total using our sidereal year today. Math makes me nervous. In other words, the point is 600 years by the Maya tune method of calculating time would turn out to 8.64 years shorter than 600 years in today's conventional sense. If we mark off 600 tune years from Zedekiah's first year, 597 to 96, brings the year overlapping 5 to 4 BC, an acceptable date for Christ's birth. If the Nephite year had been the same as our present year, 365 days, then the Book of Mormon prophecies and its history as well would be in error, as E.D. Howe said. For from Zedekiah to Christ's birth is not in fact 600, but closer to 592 of our solar years. But if we suppose that the Nephites used a method of calculating time that was standard in southern Mesoamerica, where their Nephite lands must lie, then 600 of the 360-day tune years used there matches rather neatly the apparent interval from Zedekiah to Christ. Not only is the problem eliminated, but we obtain an important perspective of the Nephites' use of calendar system that prevailed in their geographical and cultural setting. I'll talk about this one here, and I just want to summarize a few things that I've noted. Here's one. Book contains evidence of modern origin. It's a Turkish weapon not known until after the time of Muhammad. That's how they spelled it. Even B.H. Roberts found this one to be a puzzler. But in fact, this is actually, there's good evidence for this. Cimeters of various forms were known in the ancient Near East long before Lehi's day. And there are a few examples. These are some Egyptian ones. But I want to talk about Mesoamerica for a minute. We often talk about Mesoamerican weapons. We talk about the Aztec macuitl as kind of an example of the kind of sword that was available in Mesoamerica, but nobody ever talks about curved swords, which we now know there were. Ross Hassig, who's written some important works on Mesoamerican warfare that are interest to the Book of Mormon, he notes a weapon called the short sword, which was lighter. It was and carried more cutting surface. Each blade was backed by a wooden base that provided direct support. It was curved and the blade was on the outward curve. Shorter than spears, lighter than clubs, the short sword was considerably more mobile. Its use marked a major shift in single-handed weapons away from the weight of the crushing power of clubs to the cutting surface and lightness of swords. It was now feasible for a single soldier to carry a short sword, atlatl, darts, and a knife, and a shield supported by an arm strap. Instead of dividing their forces into mutually reinforcing atlatlists and spearmen, soldiers could now provide their own covering fire with atlatls while they advanced to still engage in hand-to-hand combat with short swords once they closed with the enemy. That's what some of these look like. These are from the post-classic period. This is, if you notice the curved weapon there, the thing that looks like a deer antler that's red is a blood glyph that shows blood dripping from the blade there. Here's an example, as you can see, different colors there. See, it was pointed. It could be pointed. It wasn't always pointed. All right, this is from Tony Na, and it's one of Mary Miller or Simon Martin in their book. The Lord on this panel wears a jester god headband of exalted rank, holds a scimitar-like flint blade in his right hand. Okay, but what about Book of Mormon times? These all were somewhat later. Ross Hassick thinks that the short sword, which I call a scimitar, was a post-classic Toltec invention. It would be much later, several hundred years later in the Book of Mormon. But not too long ago, Ann Cyphers, who's one of the leading archaeologists at San Lorenzo, which you're familiar with, discovered several monuments that have weapons on them. Some of these are straight weapons that she argues are early versions of what the Aztecs would call a macuil. But some are straight, and if you notice the one on the right in that first picture is curved, and then it has these triangular blades, which she suggests may be either shark teeth or perhaps obsidian blades. Here she notes the two macanas, which is a macuil basically, and a picture below is similar in their lower ends or handles, each one with triangular perforation near the base. The more complete one has a curved body with 11 triangular elements encrusted in the sides. An object in the form of a curved macana, 14 triangular blades, possibly shark teeth or dog teeth or sherds of obsidian, encrusted into the sides there. So there you got a curved weapon going back to 1200 BC or thereabouts. So I thought you'd find that interesting in terms of scimitars, which we have in both the Old World and apparently in the New. You probably have heard of this one before. It's not something to lose your head over. You know the passage. I won't read it. You know who was there and what happened. It wasn't pleasant, and critics have had a field day. Coriantumr struck off his head. After this, Shiz rose up, struggled for breath, fell, and expired. There's courage for you. The Irish soldier who ran a mile after his head, which a cannonball carried away, is no touch to General Shiz. That's 1842. Well, a number of years ago, they published in BYU Studies an article by a doctor, Gary Hatfield, who's an expertise in these kinds of strange things. He notes, Shiz's death struggle illustrates the classic reflex posture that occurs in both humans and animals when the upper brainstem, midbrain, is disconnected from the brain. The extensor muscles of the arms and legs contract, and this reflex action could cause Shiz to raise up on his hands. Of course, Shiz would not have remained long in this position, and he would have bled to death through the severed arteries that go to the head. The brainstem is located inside the base of the skull and is relatively small. It connects the brain proper with the spinal cord or the neck. Hang on to your lunch. Coriantumr was obviously too exhausted to do a clean job. His stroke evidently strayed a little too high. He must have cut off Shiz's head through the base of the skull at the level of the midbrain instead of lower through the cervical spine and the curvature of the neck. Critics have questioned this story in the Book of Mormon, but this extraneous detail, by an observer, provides another solid indication that the Book of Mormon is an accurate record. Significantly, this nervous system phenomenon, decerebral rigidity, was first reported in 1898, long after the Book of Mormon was published. He further notes in another place that the blood pouring into his trachea would help enhance the eerie sound of struggling for breath. For just as brainstem reflex activity would force the extensor muscles in Shiz's extremities to contract and elevate his frame, it would also cause his ribcage to expand and contract automatically, as it does in all of us when we're sleeping or not trying to control our breathing, which is most of the time. This unconscious respiratory reflex is controlled by the lower brainstem. Just one note, could Mesoamerican swords chop off a head? Yes. We have Mesoamerican art that portrays this happening, as you can see in these two examples from different parts of Mexico. And you have it mentioned in Diego Duran talks about two instances where heads are being severed by Aztec swords. One time there was an ambassador that carried a message to an enemy. The enemy chops off the ambassador's head. The head was then carried to the boundaries of Tenochtitlan, where it was thrown, and it starts a minor war that ends badly for the provocateurs. Pre-Columbian writing. According to Mormon, these Native Americans could read and write. But when that country first became known to Europeans, the inhabitants knew no more about letters than a four-legged animal knows the rules of logic, and not a scrap of writing was found. It's a well-known fact that the Indians had no books, and among the 20 millions who were scattered about the three Americas, when Columbus made his discovery 400 years ago, none of them could read, and consequently they had no literature to transmit. Well, this is completely wrong, at least for Mesoamerica, where there are many examples. John Sorensen, I'll refer you to his article on Book of Mormon as a Mesoamerican record in the volume Book of Mormon Authorship Revisited. In respect to form, content, social functions, materials, a number of other things, the Book of Mormon in many ways resembles records from pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Here's one thing I'll just note. This is from a book by Michael Coe and Justin Carey on the art of the Maya scribe. Incised on the sides of a whiteware ceramic bowl in the collection in the Snipe Museum in Notre Dame are the representations of two objects which appear to be side views of codices, each bound with a ribbon or cord. Although this vessel has no archaeological context, it is identical in style to Olmec pottery made at the site of Tlapacoya in the Valley of Mexico during the Pre-Classic, and is thus contemporary with the apogee of San Lorenzo. If so, then screenfold codex made from amate barks coated with gesso may already have been present in Mesoamerican culture as early as 1200 BC. Barley, we talked a little bit about that. Let me just cite a few critics. It's a somewhat stubborn fact. Barley was never found upon either of the Western continents until imported by Europeans. Where is the proof of this extraordinary assertion? If Americans had once had barley, they would not have given up their cultivation and use of it, and yet they were not found when America and the Europeans came. If there was no barley in America until a white man came, then Alma 11 must be false. If God were the one that wrote the Book of Mormon, is it not reasonable assumption he would have known there was no barley in the New World? The Book of Mormon falls short of authenticatable truth. Well, here's some pictures of pre-Columbian domesticated barley. Perhaps the most startling evidence, this was in the very first Farms Update back in 1984. Hohokam agricultural sophistication came last year when salvage archaeologists in Phoenix found preserved grains of what looks like domesticated barley, the first ever found in the New World. Later, that was in the American Southwest. They've since found it in the Mississippi River area, but it's more widespread than that. Even now, there have been dissertations written on it. It's reasonable to conclude we're looking at a North American domesticated grain crop whose existence has not been suspected. It goes back several thousand years, its use. And I might note, Mark Wright, who's here today, put me on a source. They've even found it in Cuba now. Pre-Columbian barley, it was pretty widespread. And there are some indications, although there is a lot of uncertainty about the timing, that we believe, as one scholar said, that this species of barley may have migrated from the south to the north with migration ways between the two continents were existent. The exact timing and routes are not possible to indicate, but Central America has probably acted as a bridge and stepping stone. So even though we haven't found any in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica at this time, there are some indications it did come from the south. I want to close here by one final example here. And I'm going to pull up my notes here so I get this right. If you have not seen the article that was in BYU Studies a number of years ago by Bart Kowalis, a geologist at BYU, called in the 30 and 4th year, geologist looks at 3rd Nephi. I recommend you look at that. He talks about this, but first, let's take one of our critics. The author evidently mounts the fiery steed of his imagination, talking about the destruction in 3rd Nephi, and herds together every strange thing, every wonderful thing, every blood-curdling story, every impossible thing he had ever heard of or thought of, dreamed of, and attempts in this master effort to combine them all in one huge miracle. 1912, Reverend Spalding in Salt Lake, the account of convulsions of nature which occurred in America at the time of Christ's coming would compel the geologist to re-examine his theories as to the formation of land and sea, and the astronomer to adjust the laws of the heavens to the wonderful 3 days of darkness. Geology and the Book of Mormon are irreconcilable. There is no geological or archaeological evidence to support such a destruction. Well, one of the things that Bart Kowalis does, as he talks about all of the elements that are described in 3rd Nephi, and shows how they make very good sense and can be attested in descriptions for people who have encountered volcanic disasters and their surrounding effects. Now, we also, Jerry Grover's here today, and he's also written a book, and he has argued, I think convincingly, that you probably have at least one major eruption and a major earthquake together that would account for these things. John Sorensen's recently summarized this, and I'm not going to quote Bart Kowalis here, but I want to talk about one that John Sorensen did mention, but there has been more recent research that may be of interest to you, and I just want to share that here in closing. Sorensen cites a 1998 report of this eruption, this volcano between Pueblo and the Valley of Mexico. Initial tests available of the material dated this eruption to 45 BC to 90 AD. Archaeologists Patricia Plunkett and Gabriela Uranela, working at the site of Tentipa, Pueblo, Mexico, have subsequently published additional data and findings from their work which shed further light on the eruption. This volcanic event, a V6 Plinian eruption, that's about the size of Krakatoa, if you're trying to place it, created a column of tephra from 20 to 30 kilometers high, and is believed to have caused an ecological disaster of unprecedented proportions, that's their description, which significantly impacted the population and development of the cultures in the region. The archaeology of the Basin of Mexico indicates that sometime between 100 BC and 100 AD, population in the region became concentrated around the site of Teotihuacan. Some had suggested that this may have been due to political pressure from that city. These archaeologists suggest rather that this relocation northward was more likely due to necessity resulting from volcanic destruction further south. The Popocatepetl eruption would have destroyed prime agricultural regions of the southern and eastern basin of Mexico. Quote, as pyroclastic materials fell on the forested slopes, the ash would have suffocated wildlife. The hot pyroclastic flows, with temperatures between 250 and 600 degrees Celsius, may have ignited multiple highly destructive forest fires that would have spread quickly through the Sierra Nevada during the dry season. And the melting glacier would have formed destructive lahars that rushed down the steep canyons into the Amaquemaca River in the Chalco area. Destruction of important hunting and gathering areas would have been devastated, and smoke from the fires added to the ash could have caused significant short-term climatic changes as well, including frost, drought, that may have resulted in famine and consequent population relocation. Plunkett and Uranela explain that prior to 100 BC, at the southern end of the basin, most of the population lived in towns and villages along the lakeshore between Coquilco and Chalco, but after 100 AD, almost all of these settlements disappeared. They estimate that as many as 20,000 people in the basin of Mexico may have perished in the disaster, while as many as 50,000 relocated further north to Teotihuacan, swelling the size of its population and spurring its subsequent development. The eruption would have caused similar disruptions on the eastern side of the mountains, in western Puebla, where scholars estimate that the population was about 100,000 just prior to that time. Quote, the large complex regional centers close to the Sierra Nevada, Colotzinco, Coapan, Xochicalco, and a number of other sites were abandoned at that time. Afterwards, as happened at Teotihuacan, population became concentrated at Cholula and a few other settlements, but the total number of inhabitants appears to have diminished perhaps by as much as 30%. Now, earlier reports from the archaeological team mentioned above tentatively placed that eruption toward the end of the 1st century AD. Now, a total of 14 radiocarbon dates have been obtained, including an AMS date from a carbonized corn cob recovered from a sealed jar, which yielded a reading of 2010 plus or minus 40 BP. That is calibrated 100 BC to 70. These dates, in addition to cultural materials retrieved from the ash-buried houses at Tintipa, indicate that the eruption, quote, probably took place during the first half of the 1st century AD, end quote. Based upon the archaeological evidence from crops, seasonal cooking patterns found at the site, wind studies, they also suggest, this is another quote, the most likely time of the eruption is late March or early April. The basin of Mexico would be at approximately the northernmost extremity of most Mesoamerican models of Book of Mormon geography, but the apparent timing of the eruption is of potential interest in light of the death of Jesus around the time of Passover, which some place about that time as well. In closing, notwithstanding that a determined effort was made after he removed from the state of New York by hunting up evidence at Palmyra and Manchester to prove the Book of Mormon to be a mere human production, and although various charges were brought against him, yet so well known was it that he was an unlearned youth that the idea of charging him with an education did not occur to his active opposers. They made charges against him, but no person, either in Palmyra or Manchester, accused him of ever buying a book or entering a library. The fact of the matter is that even the best libraries in 1830 would have been of little help to young Joseph on these particular things. Many Book of Mormon names have only found confirmation and discovery subsequent to his death, some just a few years ago. The same could be said of most of the things that I've mentioned. The force of this category of evidence, of Howlers in the Book of Mormon, is strengthened by the fact that these things were not simply ignored, but often dismissed with amusement as contrary to accepted evidence and as proof that the Book of Mormon could not be a real translation of an ancient record. That these have since proven to be accurate goes far, in my view, in supporting my contention that the Book of Mormon was exactly what Joseph Smith claimed it to be. For if the most learned and self-assured critics of the 19th and 20th centuries did not know it, how did Joseph Smith?